When we talk about attachment problems, procrastination, or personal blockages, the first thing we always hear is, "Oh dear, you probably had a difficult childhood." But although the cause often lies in traumatic experiences in childhood, trauma can also manifest itself in completely different forms. Today, you will find out what the 5 most common forms of trauma are, how social and collective trauma can sabotage you to develop personal blockages, and how you can free yourself from these wounds from the past. This episode is a little different, a little more philosophical and spiritual than usual, but I think that's why it's particularly worth watching, so be sure to stay tuned up till the end. Welcome to today's episode. My name is Robert, and today we talk about childhood trauma, versus transgenerational trauma and reincarnational trauma. And a disclaimer here up front, I'm not a health professional. The contents in this video are not to be understood as therapeutic medical instructions or advice, and everything I say here is based on research, my work with therapists, or personal experience. And also, if you struggle with dysregulation, with trauma symptoms, I want to remind you that we have a free workbook where you can learn how to re-regulate your nervous system in 3 steps. And the workbook shows you the best writing techniques to clear your mind, the best grounding skills and tools to re-regulate your nervous system, and the method to reconnect with yourself and others using the emotion wheel. Go to understandable-podcast.com and grab your free copy now. You'll find all the links and resources in the description below. Trauma is affecting many individuals worldwide. But not just individuals, but whole societies and cultures can be traumatized. If whole groups of people are affected, then this might lead to inhibited societies. Trauma then is passed from one generation to the next one and is also cross-linking to other societies and individuals at the same time. Various reasons like severe events like war, attacks, but also the pressure of norms of politics and society can create trauma in groups and individuals. But also recurring small events like emotional neglect, for example, in the childhood, can cause trauma to happen. The effects on us human beings are enormous. Gabor Mate, for example, describes it as that we live in a sick society. Nowadays, young people in particular are considered to be incapable of attachment, struggling with depressive states more and more, with loneliness, addictions, or other personal blockages. Entire societies are characterized by emotions such as shame, guilt, or fear, which are attached to us like iron chains and hinder us from truly being authentically ourselves. That all sounds pretty negative at first, and as I am fundamentally optimistic, today I would like to shed a light on the causes and reasons for this development and look at the possible solutions and therapeutic approaches we have today so that our generation can finally break the cycle and heal the wounds from the past. Now, I came up with a potential trauma history here. And therefore, we have at least 5 different types of trauma. We have adulthood PTSD, we have childhood PTSD, we have prenatal trauma, we have transgenerational trauma, and we have reincarnational collective trauma. I made this funny graphics here for you to visualize the chain and the ideas of trauma history that I have. Now let's first talk about adulthood PTSD. We are in our current journey. You are an adult, and what can happen to you is that you might experience a horrible thing like a car accident, like an attack, and you survive this scenario. But during your lifetime, when you experience those tremendously horrible events, they might leave wounds within you. And those wounds is what we describe as adulthood post-traumatic stress disorder. So that is the first form of trauma here, and we will go into depth into all of these 5 later. The next one that might happen to you is when we go back, you're not an adult anymore, but you're a child. And during your childhood, after your mother gave birth, you started to thrive your life in this world, you may experience some events like emotional neglect. You may have a narcissistic parent. You may experience insultation, criticism as a child. Someone might scream at you. And all of these things leave wounds in you as well. Those wounds we call childhood or complex post-traumatic stress disorder. When we go even more back in time, after the sperm of your dad fertilizes the egg of your mom, because then you were in the tummy of your mom, we talk about prenatal trauma. Now, during that time, many things can happen to your mom. And you might also experience stressful situations already during the time in your mother's body. If we go even more back, before you have been conceived, your parents, your grandparents, they also might experience some horrible things that left wounds within them. And what can happen here, especially if your grandparents went to war, they can pass on those traumatic experiences to their children, to your mom, to your dad, and they might pass on their experiences to you. Now, this is when we talk about transgenerational trauma. And the 5th and last step is collective or reincarnational trauma. Now let's talk about those 5 forms of trauma in a bit of more depth. First of all, adulthood PTSD. Now, PTSD is what we know from medical literature, post-traumatic stress disorder. And post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental and behavioral disorder that develops from experiencing a traumatic event such as sexual assault, warfare, traffic collisions, child abuse, domestic violence, or other threats on a person's life or well-being. Some more examples I have here are severe one-time events, because that's typical for PTSD, especially in adulthood. As I said, car collisions, war, attacks, heist, or other forms of abuse that often are seen as a once-in-a-lifetime experience with a severe impact. Now, then we have childhood complex post-traumatic stress disorder. CPTSD is a mental health condition that can develop if you experience long-term trauma, often during childhood. Often emotional neglect, so not the bad things that happened, but the good things that didn't happen that should have, lead to complex PTSD and their related symptoms. And I don't want to expand those 2 here because I've made so many episodes in the past about them already. And I recommend you watching, for example, this one about emotional neglect, where we talk a lot about those specific symptoms. But then we have also prenatal trauma. Prenatal trauma are all experiences which can leave wounds within you before and during birth. So pre- and perinatal trauma refer to any experience of trauma that occurs during the period from conception to birth. And these experiences can include physical or emotional abuse, neglect, substance abuse, maternal stress, maternal illness, maternal malnutrition, or other adverse experiences that occur during pregnancy or childbirth. There is this one-pager from the Australian government describing this form of trauma as the in utero experience, and they say that any stress the mother experiences, so the maternal stress, can transfer to the child. If the type of stress is particularly bad, this can cause the child trauma. Trauma in utero is commonly caused by chaotic or unpredictable lifestyle factors, including, but not limited to, the mother's exposure to domestic violence, lack of antenatal care, or substance misuse during pregnancy. Stress experienced by the mother can lead to elevated levels of the stress hormone cortisol in her body, which can then be passed onto her unborn child via the placenta. And this then causes changes already in the brain of the unborn. Elevated levels of cortisol and fetal distress can impact the architecture of the child's developing brain, possibly changing its size, its shape, its structure and organization, and this can result in reduced and impaired functioning here. Considering the brain develops in a bottom-up fashion, if the lower areas of the brain that develop first become oversensitive to stress, they can cause development problems in higher areas of the brain that are responsible for higher order thinking, such as impulse inhibition, problem solving, and rational decision making. These problems then limit the child's capacity after birth to respond to stimuli and situations in a calm and rational manner. Even seemingly minor incidents can trigger the child beyond their coping capacity. And that's extremely interesting here, and I want to discuss that for a bit. If we have such impact on the child's brain already before birth, as we read here, development problems in higher brain areas that are responsible for thinking, for impulse inhibition, for rational decision making, and those changes in the brain that make the child respond more intensely to stimuli, which give the child problems to calm down, to re-regulate him or herself, then the questions I'm interested here is, may that also cause, for example, sensory processing sensitivities? So is a child already more sensitive to stimuli before birth if he or she experienced maternal and prenatal trauma here? What about autism, for example? What about ADHD? Would be interesting to see, and maybe you know that, so definitely leave a comment if you know some studies on that, if you have read some papers on that. Is the chance higher to develop things like autism and ADHD due to the exposure of prenatal trauma? Would be really interesting. And I know that autism and ADHD are also genetic things, that there are genetic components, but the interesting thing is to which degree prenatal trauma might have an influence, and to which degree the environment before birth influences the ability of dealing with stress responses, with things like impulsivity and with sensitivity during the lifetime. Now, I found this paper that points out a prevalence rate of 6 to 8% in the perinatal period. And there is also a great visualization here that shows how trauma can form before birth and what factors increase the risk. Now, this visualization is directed to the life of the mother and how trauma during the mother's lifetime influences the lifetime of the newborn child. Now, when the mother already in her childhood experienced maltreatment, abuse, neglect, and family adversities, and in her adolescence she also might have experienced maltreatment, abuse, neglect, or bullying, then this definitely has an effect on her adult life. Which partner will she choose? Will she choose someone who's also violating her? Will she choose someone who's also struggling with trauma things, with things from his childhood that make the relationship extremely difficult? And that causes even more trauma in her life. Now, when this traumatized mother is now giving birth to an unborn, then the child will also suffer from her traumatic experiences that left wounds within her. It's really interesting when you look at the data. There is one paper here that mentions that PTSD symptoms during perinatal periods are likely to be due to an exacerbation of pre-existing PTSD. Childhood maltreatment in the mother therefore causes a 12-fold risk in developing PTSD during pregnancy, and I think that's absolutely likely here that she will pass that on to her child. And there we have a good example of trauma passed to the next generation, which is a great transition to the next form of trauma, which is transgenerational trauma. Transgenerational trauma is the psychological and physiological effects that the trauma experienced by people has on the subsequent generations in their group. The primary mode of transmission is the shared family environment of the infant, causing psychological, behavioral, and social changes in the individual. Now, transgenerational trauma can be a collective experience on the one hand that affects a group of people who share a cultural identity, for example, ethnicity, nationality, or religious identity, and it can also be applied to single families or individual parent-child dyads, for example, survivors of individual child abuse and both direct survivors of the collective trauma and members of subsequent generations individually may develop complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Usually the term, as you see, is used synonym for collective trauma, partly. But what I mean and what I want to describe by that now is the trauma that your parents and grandparents experienced and that they didn't heal. My first therapist, for example, talked about that phenomenon that our generation now has to carry the wounds from our parents and grandparents who had to deal with the consequences of war and brutality. The author Sabine Bode wrote a whole book about this generation called Kriegsenkel, Grandchildren of War. And if you're German, you can definitely read it. I put the link in the description below. And then we have the fifth form of trauma, which is reincarnational and collective trauma. First of all, if we talk about reincarnational trauma, that is a concept. And the question behind that concept is, are we bringing trauma into this life from the past, and why? That's definitely a more philosophical and spiritual question, and I did some research on it and found this post on Quora.com where this question was posted: do humans bring trauma into this life from a past life, and why? Now, there are some people commenting on that, and someone commented, I certainly believe we do. One type of trauma one brings into their current lives are lessons not learned. The reason we are here in the first place is to learn lessons. If we didn't learn them in the past life, they will present it again in this life. If they were traumatic, that comes with the lessons also. The other type of trauma is usually associated with a violent death. We see this emerge with young children. A young child is terrified of buses, and we find out later that he was run over by a bus in a previous life. Another child was freaked out by the reports from the 4th of July fireworks. Turns out he was killed in the Civil War on the battlefield. He left a wife and a child behind. Once this memory is surfaced, his fear of loud reports disappeared. Now, what this person describes here is that experiences from past lives reoccur in the current life. For example, from this child here who is afraid of fireworks, and he links this fear of fireworks to an experience in a past life where this person was killed. People who discuss this post on Quora also bring up another question, and the question is if the preferences and things we like to do then also come from past experiences. Because it would make sense if we bring bad experiences, if we bring trauma from past lives into our current life, then we also might bring, the things we really love, the preferences, the things that make us up in a positive way to our current lives. And there are some people agreeing on that. They say, yes, we bring trauma to our current lives, but we also bring the positive emotions too here. I think that's definitely a really interesting hypothesis here. I don't know if you believe in reincarnation or not, but it's definitely worth thinking about the possibility. Because if we think about where thoughts actually come from, where the things we really like or we fear actually come from, then you can come to that conclusion. Some people would say, well, it's in your DNA. Other people would say, well, it's your instincts. Some people would think it's just learned from society and other people when you were young. Maybe it's a combination of all of them. What I also want to bring up here is the possible explanation behind why we have thoughts at all and why we have visions, why we have certain memories, certain pictures in our minds. Because I don't think there is clear evidence why we have those thoughts popping up within our consciousness. Can we explain where those thoughts come from? Probably not. And some people are convinced that they have visions and memories from past lives, that they have made experiences before this life that they actually live at the moment. To explore that a bit more, I want to do a quick excursus with you to the question what thoughts actually are and where they come from. I've heard a really interesting talk recently. It's by Jordan Peterson, and before you now just close the video, you may like Jordan or not, but he has a really fascinating philosophical talk on the idea of God, where he talks about dreams and the origin of thoughts that come out of our mind, that sometimes just pop up, that create those experiences and those visions and those pictures within our head. If you want to watch it, it's in the first episode of his Bible series, and I want to watch with you together now the part where he talks about thoughts and the birthplace of thinking, and he questions that. Where are those things coming from? Are thoughts coming from God? Are those memories from the past? What is actually happening there within our conscious?
The dream is the birthplace of thinking. And so because it's the birthplace of thinking, it's not that clear. It's doing its best to formulate something. That was Jung's notion, as opposed to Freud, who believed that there were sensors, internal sensors, that were hiding the dream's true message. That's not what Jung believed. He believed the dream was doing its best to express a reality that was still outside of fully articulated conscious comprehension. Because you think, look, a thought appears in your head, right? That's obvious. Bang, it's nothing you ever ask about. But what the hell does that mean? A thought appears in your head. What kind of ridiculous explanation is that? You know, it just doesn't help with anything. Where does it come from? Well, nowhere. It just appears in my head. Okay, well, that's not a very sophisticated explanation, as it turns out, you know? And so you might think that those thoughts that you think, well, where do they come from? Well, they're often someone else's thoughts, right? Someone long dead, that might be part of it. Just like the words you use to think are utterances of people who've been long dead. And so you're informed by the spirit of your ancestors. That's one way of looking at it. And your motivations speak to you, and your emotions speak to you, and your body speaks to you. And it all does all that, at least in part, through the dream.
Now, we don't finally know and we can't explain where our thoughts actually come from, where they have their origin, if they're memories from past experiences or if they just pop up or sent to us by God. Who knows? Well, for some people, it's still a crystal clear thing that visions they might experience and trauma that blocks them comes from past life experiences. There are also therapy approaches like regression therapy or craniosacral therapy that are based on this assumption and support clients to heal traumatic wounds from previous lives through targeted regression, for example, using hypnotic and deeply focused states. Craniosacral therapist and counselor Lulu Ferrand writes on her blog, "I don't get visions myself. Very occasionally, I get a thought that pops up into my head. But it just feels like something very profound is going on." For the client, they often see visions behind their eyes, maybe also smell or taste, or just have a deep sense of inner knowing. Generally, at the end of the session, the client feels such a sense of relief and understanding of their current behaviors or beliefs. We usually sit in utter amazement about what just happened, and every time we say, wow, it can be a very liberating experience, and I feel honored and blessed to be part of the process. I've had North American slaves who had been chained, a fighter pilot who drowned when his plane went down, arrows in the shoulders, knives in the necks, cannonballs in legs, many hanging or executions, and several burnings. I had so many from so many different kinds that for me, it is absolutely without question that reincarnation happens. That got me to beginning to understand the soul. The past life experiences also revealed that at some stage my clients may have been the opposite sex or have a different colored skin. Clients often have had many reincarnations, so several traumatic deaths or experiences that need resolving. Well, now you can say that's absolutely insane, that's crazy, I don't believe in reincarnation, or you might say, well, that's absolutely plausible, I get it, I understand. I don't have visions, and I'm also not sure of how much of my wounds come from past experiences and how much come from pre- and postnatal maternal experiences. But I believe if regression therapy and healing of wounds from reincarnational, potentially trauma, helps people to recover and feel free again, then I think that's an absolutely beautiful approach to discover if you're open for that. One thing I also want to talk about now is collective trauma. Collective trauma is also, I would say, partly connected with what I describe as reincarnational trauma here. Now, what's definitely true for us as mankind, we collectively experienced, sadly, events like war, for example, which traumatizes whole societies and leaves scars and wounds within our history. And there are a couple really good examples for collective trauma, which are, on the one hand, the Holocaust, the American genocide, slavery in the United States, for example, the Nanjing massacre, atomic bombings, Pearl Harbor, 9/11, but also things like the COVID-19 pandemic. Those things did happen to a group of people, to many of us, sadly, and those are horrible things. But they definitely shape us as a society and as a group. But what is that doing to us? This is what Michael Voll is investigating in a paper, because he questioned, is there an effect of collective trauma on the mental health of us individuals? And he found out that there is an effect, because analysis confirmed that these effects were specific to Holocaust-related PTSD symptoms and not general anxiety or depression. These findings suggest that collective identity may both buffer and enhance the effects of collective victimization on mental health. So yes, trauma experienced as a group, as a society, definitely has an effect on the mental health of an individual. What also has an effect on mental health of individuals is how society is directed. I also assume that guilt, shame, and fear societies are created based on those traumatic wounds within groups. Now, there is this concept of the guilt, shame, and fear spectrum of cultures here. And this classification has been applied especially to what anthropologist Ruth Benedict called Apollonian societies, sorting them according to the emotions they use to control individuals, especially children, and maintaining social order, swaying them into norm, obedience, and conformity. The three categories Ruth Benedict sorts societies in are the guilt society, which is controlled and maintained by creating and continually reinforcing the feeling of guilt. Those societies often ask questions like, is my behavior fair or unfair? Then we have shame societies, sometimes also called honor shame culture. The means of control is the inculcation of shame and the complementary threat of ostracism. People in those societies may ask, shall I look ashamed if I do X, Y, that? Or how will people look at me if I do Y? And then we have fear societies, where control is kept by the fear of retribution. Those persons might ask, will someone hurt me if I do this? America is an example for a guilt culture. Japan for shame culture, same as China and the Balkan countries. And I think that definitely those cultures, those primary emotions where those cultures are based on have a collective traumatic effect on the individuals in those countries as well. That's my hypothesis. Okay, let's also talk about solutions here. If we talk about so much trauma here, that's definitely really negative. But what can we do? Which solutions are there for this overwhelming amount of trauma histories you might all have? I would like to first of all emphasize that you shouldn't overthink it. Don't make it too complicated. Because if you just talk and think about trauma constantly, you will get lost in that. You will lose yourself in negative thought spirals. So focus yourself on the solutions we have here. How can we break free as individuals and as a society from those chains of past wounds? First of all, when we talk about those three types of trauma, so adulthood PTSD, childhood PTSD, or prenatal trauma, that affect us as individuals, then we can definitely focus on freeing ourselves from those wounds. There are many different forms of therapy approaches we can use. For example, when you struggle with adulthood PTSD, with war-based PTSD, then there is psychoanalytical psychotherapy as a good tool to first of all understand what's actually going on or what you experienced. I'm not a fan of medication, but it might also be helpful to understand those kind of things. Exposure therapy might work, but what's definitely important is to look for a specialist to understand and resolve those things you might experience during those severe events. If you experience childhood complex post-traumatic stress disorder, I already made so many episodes about those. You can use, for example, skills and resources, writing techniques, first of all, to understand and re-regulate your dysregulated nervous system. To do so, I recommend you using our free workbook. You can get on and download on understandable-podcast.com. Psychoanalytical psychotherapy is also a good tool. Somatic experiencing is a really good tool, as well as for prenatal trauma. Those somatic approaches can help you to reconnect with your body if that's causing trauma, to be connected with yourself if you constantly dissociate. Also, approaches like hypnotherapy or methods that directly address your unconscious can be really helpful. For prenatal trauma, it's also important to have a look at, as I said, somatic approaches like body-orientated therapies. Also, techniques like massage or craniosacral therapy are helpful to address physical manifestations of trauma, which are often the case in prenatal trauma because you were kind of trapped within that body of your mom. Skills like weighted blankets can be really helpful to readdress the sensation of safety when you have a weighted blanket around your shoulder, and that helps you to better connect with yourself. But what about things like transgenerational trauma or even reincarnational and collective trauma? Can you do things as an individual to heal these forms of collective trauma? Well, first of all, definitely take responsibility for yourself. You have the ability, especially if trauma was passed from your parents and grandparents, to now break that cycle of your family and to free your whole family and further generations from passing the trauma on. What helps here to understand transgenerational trauma is definitely to work with family system therapy. Also, genogram therapy can be helpful. It's to use a genogram, a visual representation of a family tree, to clearly identify and understand the patterns of behavior and trauma in your family. Therefore, you can understand where the roots are and then work back from them to identify your personal challenges and resolve them. Psychoanalytical therapy is also a good way to go really deep into your unconscious and understand where those things actually come from and then reconnect with yourself. If you believe in reincarnation and concepts of the soul, then past life regression therapy, as I said, can be a wonderful thing. You can also use hypnotic and deep meditative states to explore past life memories, to bring them up and resolve them so that you can break free from the current trauma symptoms in your current life. Transpersonal therapy can also be helpful. This approach integrates spiritual aspects and explores beyond the individual's psyche to address collective and reincarnational trauma. And cultural healing practices, individual for each culture, can also be an interesting approach that involves traditional rituals and practices from the individual's culture's background to address the collective trauma which roots within the group and culture. And some final thoughts from my side. I think it's absolutely fascinating if we think about how our human body and mind concept actually works. Whether we bring experiences, positive and negative, so good things we like and prefer, and the traumatic wounds from the past, whether it happened to us as being children, before birth, in our parents' generation, grandparents' generation, or as a collective trauma, or within another life, which reincarnated in our actual life. Experiences and memories are stored within us somewhere that influence our thoughts, our emotions, and our behavior that we might have today. Trauma-based symptoms such as somatic symptoms, anxieties, fears, things we don't like, things we love, they all point to the fact that we should listen carefully to what our instincts, our thoughts, our emotions are telling us. Can we learn lessons from them? Can we understand where we can resolve those things, where we can expect more freedom if we break free from them? I wouldn't see those wounds from the past as bad things in general. Yes, there were tremendously horrible events going on for individuals, for societies, for whole cultures. That's for sure. But in the here and now, we should use those wounds from the past to identify solutions and to listen to them carefully, to learn the lessons, to live our life more fulfilled. What do you think about those 5 types of trauma? Do you believe in reincarnation, and do you think we carry wounds from past lives? Definitely leave me a comment below today's episode. If you want to support this podcast, leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And I see and speak to you in the next episode. Have a great day.